Welcome. Sometimes what goes around comes around. So it was in 1766 when citizens of Philadelphia saw a new book for sale. The title was in Latin, but translates as On the Law of Kingship Among the Scots. You wouldn't know from the title page, but this work was almost 200 years old. So why was such an old book about Scottish monarchy published in the American colonies in the mid-18th century? The answer brings us to a simple fact. Americans don't generally think about it, but the American Revolution happened within a British context. And this means that the American Revolution took place in a world where the historical range of reference reached deeply into the British past. Today, we'll look at the American Revolution from a series of British perspectives, but our focus will be on the experiences and perceptions of those known today as Loyalists. The end result is a different perspective, but I think a more compelling one on the American Revolution. If we flipped through the edition of Buchanan's book printed in the American colonies, we would find that the volume also contained several works by an author named John Knox, who also lived in the 16th century. Here we see the title page before his works followed. The title reads, "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women." The title no doubt sounds odd, even obnoxious, especially today. But don't let that distract you. It's not about women as such, but about Knox's opposition to Mary Tudor, Queen of England. Knox and Buchanan's writings advocated resistance theory, that is, justifications for overthrowing monarchies. In fact, Buchanan's book was banned in both Scotland and England. Knox had the good sense to have his work published in Geneva, which is now part of Switzerland. But other of his writings were banned in England, and after publishing his Trumpet Blast, Knox was banned from ever returning to England. A militant Protestant and one of the first ever called a Puritan, Knox settled in Scotland, where he helped overthrow Catholicism and denied the right of the monarch to make decisions about religion, a series of positions and actions that eventually tumbled into full-blown civil war. Because of the First Amendment and its guarantee of religious freedom, it may come as a surprise that religious conflict was also a major issue in the American Revolution. And yet, it is well known that the religious disputes of 16th century Europe gave way to religious war, both then and in the century that followed. So, it shouldn't surprise us that the partial revival of 16th century resistance theory also led to a partial revival of older religious disputes. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritans had opposed bishops, and pre-revolutionary unrest in British America saw a version of this same debate. At stake in the 18th century was the issue of bringing Anglican bishops to the colonies. In England, the Anglican Church was the state church, and so bringing bishops would have set up England's state church in the American colonies. In fact, in a letter of 1815, John Adams, second President of the United States, said that although people had largely forgotten it, one reason for the American Revolution was to fight against the Anglican Church. Adams wrote, "Where is the man to be found at this day who will believe that the apprehension of episcopacy contributed 50 years ago, as much as any other cause, to arouse the attention not only of the inquiring mind, but of the common people, and urge them to close thinking on the constitutional authority of Parliament over the colonies?" This, nevertheless, was a fact as certain as any in the history of North America. He went on to explain that this wasn't just about bishops, although he hated bishops. It was also about how, in England, church and state supported one another. He continues, "The objection was not merely to the office of a bishop, though even that was dreaded, but to the authority of Parliament on which it must be founded." And still later he writes, "If Parliament can erect dioceses and appoint bishops, They may introduce the whole hierarchy, establish tithes, forbid marriages and funerals, establish religions, forbid dissenters, make schism heresy, impose penalties extending to life and limb, as well as to liberty and property. In other words, Adams didn't want the Anglican Church because with the Anglican Church came Anglican authority, and that authority was inseparable from that of both Parliament and the British monarchy. Let's turn now to some Loyalist responses to the American Revolution. The British Civil Wars of the 1640s were a major point of reference for some interpretations of the American Revolution. Consider Peter Oliver's book, The Origin and Progress of the American Rebellion. Oliver's use of the word rebellion is telling, and it helpfully illustrates how many Loyalists saw the Revolution through the wider sweep of British history. One of the most influential books on the British Civil Wars of the 1640s is The History of the Rebellion and Civil Wars in England, a massive work of many volumes. Its author was Edward Hyde, an ally of the King, Charles I. Hyde died in 1674, but his great history was not printed until the early 18th century. Peter Oliver's accusation of rebellion was therefore an accusation fraught with historical memory. But Oliver also located a particular point of origin for both rebellions: religion. He focused upon the work of popular preachers, alleging that they stirred up political dissent. And, whether considering the British Civil Wars or the American Revolution, he wasn't wrong. Peter Oliver was a judge. He therefore held an important public position, but most colonists didn't hold public office. In order to understand their experience of the American Revolution, we have to turn to private documents, most of which remain unpublished still today. This can give us a very different view of the American Revolution. Consider the following. In June of 1776, the Pennsylvania Assembly legislated that citizens take a new loyalty oath, one that broke with the British government, and instead pledged loyalty to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Citizens were also to abide by new laws, such as the adoption of new paper currency. But of course, some refused. And so, not a little ironically, the state government alleged that those who so refused were guilty of treason. Consider the case of Thomas and Sarah Fisher, who refused the new oath. Thomas was arrested, but Sarah kept a diary, giving us remarkable insight into her experience. Responding to the new Pennsylvania loyalty oath, she compared the state government to the Spanish Inquisition, and she described the new laws as a most extraordinary instance of arbitrary power, and of the liberty we shall enjoy should their government ever be established. A tyrannical government it will prove from weak and wicked men. And arbitrary power certainly describes her experience. After arresting her husband, Patriot soldiers returned to her home, demanding entry in order to search for more alleged traitors. She refused, but they entered anyways. To her surprise, they neither attacked her nor her servants, nor took anything from her home. Nonetheless, alleged loyalism came with a cost. The diary of someone such as Sarah Fisher carries with it an important upshot. Simply stated, it's quite difficult to determine the extent to which loyalism defined life in the colonies, both during and after the American Revolution. Yes, there was public loyalism, that of Peter Oliver, for example, who publicly protested against the Revolution. Other examples of public loyalism would include something like joining the British Army rather than that of the Patriots. But most people joined neither. Consider the following observation by Benjamin Rush of Pennsylvania and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. After noting the existence of two groups in the colonies, those who supported the Revolution, often termed Whigs, and those who opposed it, often termed Tories, he further observed, "There was, besides these two classes of people, a great number of persons who were neither Whigs nor Tories. They had no fixed principles and accommodated their conduct to their interest, to events, and to their company. They were not without their uses. They protected both parties in many instances from the rage of each other, and each party always found hospitable treatment from them. In fact, Sarah Fisher perfectly fits this description. She did not self-identify as a Loyalist. When soldiers came to her house demanding the right to search for alleged traitors, she told them that they had robbed me of what was far dearer than any property I had in the world, my husband, and that I could by no means encourage war of any kind. In other words, she hadn't taken a side, neither for the British nor for the Patriots. And yet, the revolutionary government of the state of Pennsylvania considered her and her husband Loyalists. But this raises a question. Who had the right to define loyalism? Was it a term of personal conviction, or was it a polemical term of abuse? So, quite obviously, political terms sometimes change meaning in times of war. A good example is found in entries for the word patriot in Samuel Johnson's dictionary. Johnson was the first person to ever use literature to exemplify the meaning of words, and this made his dictionary extremely popular. In the 1765 edition, the definition of patriot read in familiar terms, one whose ruling passion is the love of his country. But in 1777, 1 year after the American Revolution had begun, he added a second definition. It is sometimes used for a factious disturber of the government. Later editions of his dictionary, including those published after his death, carried the expanded definition of 1777. Resistance theorists advanced a political argument against the authority of monarchs, but their argument depended, at least in part, on religious justifications. Consider Sam Adams, the same Sam Adams whose name graces the popular American beer. He attended Harvard, where he wrote a thesis on resistance theory. Consider, too, this editorial cartoon from 1769. It originally appeared in the London periodical, The Political Register. The man fleeing onto the ship is an Anglican bishop. The mob is waving a series of works associated with political revolt. Thrown at the bishop is a book labeled Calvin's Works, that is, the writings of John Calvin, a leading 16th century Protestant whose name was later tied to the Puritan cause. Other authors' names are held by the mob. We see the name Locke, that is, John Locke, and the name Sidney, that is, Algernon Sidney. Both had been involved in attempts at overthrowing other British monarchs in the late 17th century. It's a great illustration of the intertwining of political and religious arguments and concerns. And finally, the same is true of this Revolutionary War flag. Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. The arm descending from the cloud symbolizes God, and the message is clear. God will, through military rebellion, overthrow the British government. 16th century resistance theory had a remarkably long and ultimately a transatlantic afterlife. So what? Let's take a deeper dive now into the first clause of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. It reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is sometimes known as the Establishment Clause, although it's generally known that the Constitution rejected the British approach to church and state. We should be more specific than this. In fact, the Establishment Clause was a sweeping rejection of more than a century of English law. For example, in 1673, the Test Act was ratified. It specified that political office was limited to those who received the sacrament according to the usage of the Church of England. And later in the 17th century, the monarchy itself was restricted to a member of the Anglican Church. Given the religious and political conflicts that affected 17th century England, there were good reasons for such laws. But in Article 6 of the United States Constitution, we find something very different. It reads, No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Note that the word test is not only used here, but is capitalized, undoubtedly a reference to the 1673 Test Act. And of course, The Bill of Rights further specified wide freedom for religious practice. In doing so, the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights laid the foundation for a very different kind of religious and political culture. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a broad overview of Loyalists in the American Revolution, read Choosing Sides, Loyalists in the American Revolution by Ruma Chopra. It contains a generous introduction, followed by a series of excerpts from 18th century sources. The experience of Loyalist women is covered in detail in Casey Dowd Tillman's volume, Stripped and Script, Loyalist Women Writers of the American Revolution. Turning to private works, such as diaries and unpublished correspondence, Tillman brings to life the ideals and the agonies of women who refuse to rebel. Finally, for a deep dive into the relationship between religion and revolution, read A War of Religion, Dissenters, Anglicans, and the American Revolution by James Bell. In truth, it's the book that first opened my eyes to the very British background of the American Revolution, and I highly recommend it. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.